Hallo und ganz herzlich willkommen zum
Hello,
zweiten.
and a very warm welcome to eWorld Kickoff's second day. Just as yesterday, I'm very happy to have you here, and I would like to welcome you on behalf of our whole team. This is the second day, the second morning. On the second day, my name is Buers. I'm in charge of everything that's to do with eWorld's program, scheduling, and together with our host, Heiko Lohmann, today we have a very interesting and exciting agenda for you. Before I get into the specifics of that, I would like to point out one thing. Today's event will be simultaneously translated, so you can listen to the event in either English or German. Let me show you how this works by sharing my screen.
So, Sie schauen uns in der
So,
Dort ist
you are watching us via eWorld Community, where there is two streams, an English and a German stream. Probably the German stream has started automatically, but if you scroll down, you will find the English one, and then you can open the session and get to the English video. And after this first introduction, we will have an item on the agenda which is held in English, and then the original sound will be the English version, and the German language can be heard via the German stream. So the eWorld Kickoff takes place in February, which was traditionally the on-site eWorld month. So this year that's going to be in May, which is a bit unusual, but next year, let me announce, eWorld on-site will take place in February again. So please take a note of 21st through 24th of February next year. Of course, a lot is going on this year as well, but not in the same, not around the same time. This year, the on-site eWorld will be in May 23rd through 25th. So we will now give you a kind of appetizer, a little outlook on what will happen in May, and I would now like to tell you what's expecting us today. Well, after yesterday, which was already a very interesting day where we discussed the power system, and you can always access the video online, go back in the calendar in the eWorld community, click on yesterday and watch it if you want. But for now, please stay with us and let's discuss the gas economy's future. What's happening in this sector right now? What are future scenarios that can be envisaged or at least in theory discussed? We will discuss this with Dr. Heiko Lohmann and James Watson, Secretary General of Eurogas. They will together start with a fireside chat and discuss the European market, and then we will focus on Germany in a panel discussion. Again, Heiko Lohmann will be the host, and he will debate with Dr. Gößmann, Dr. Laege, and Dr. Sury. And I'm very much looking forward to that panel as well. And after that, we will conclude and explain about the speed dating session that is an additional option for you afterwards. Tomorrow, a brief outlook on the third day of the eWorld Kickoff event. Tomorrow we will discuss IT security and data security. Again, I'm very much looking forward to it. I'm very curious to hear all the details. You find the specifics when you click on day 3 online within the eWorld community. Again, we have support today from our 3 sponsors, Odessa Group, Shell Energy, and Sherpa X.
Thank
you very much to these 3 corporations who support the kickoff event. Before we now briefly look to the 3 sponsors and towards on-site eWorld in May, let me point out, if you have any questions or comments you would like to make regarding what's happening on our virtual stage today, you can use the chat that is to the right of the embedded video. You can just type in your questions or comments. I will pass them on to Dr. Lohmann, and he will do his best to integrate your input as far as possible. Of course, content-wise and time-wise, we might not be able to take on board all questions and comments, but then, of course, we will have time afterwards for some follow-up. So, on that note, I'd like to give us all a very short virtual break, get a cup of coffee maybe, or a glass of water, or even better, stay with us and watch this teaser and trailer video, which also contains some info about our sponsors. As I said, On-Site eWorld will be in May this year, again in February next year, and you will now find some info on that in the video that will follow. And after that, we will continue in English. I'm looking forward to our fireside chat. See you there.
society is demanding change. Change to more competitive, reliable, cleaner energy. To meet this demand, the energy market is transitioning to a lower carbon future. Shell Energy, a trusted global supplier, is here to help customers make the transition, offering better ways to power business today for a cleaner tomorrow.
Hello and welcome back. Please don't be confused about my changing of languages. I am doing that because we have an English-speaking guest now. I am very happy to welcome Mr. James Watson. He's Secretary General of Eurogas. And of course, as already announced, I am joined by Mr. Heiko Lohmann, who is our moderator for today. He's an energy journalist and will be moderating this fireside chat. So imagine a fireside and enjoy the talk and exchange between the two gentlemen. I'm very excited to have you.
Okay. Anne, vielen Dank. Ich spoilere jetzt noch ein bisschen die Geschichte und rede jetzt doch noch erstmal Deutsch. Guten Morgen, meine Damen und Herren.
Thank you very much, Anne. I know that James Watson understands German, so I will briefly speak German now. I think James is married to a German woman, but he prefers speaking English.
Before you joined Eurogas as a Secretary General, you worked as the CEO for Solar Europe. That means you switched from renewables to gas, and presumably gas will become more renewable, and then the cycle will close. You will be back to renewables without changing your position. You just came back from Washington, D.C., and I appreciate very much that you are mated and willing to join me for this fireside chat. You arrived 3 hours ago. And perhaps to start with, well, we are looking now to the US very closely, in particular because of the Inflation Reduction Act and what will it do with even the energy industry here in Europe. But you have been now in Washington, and perhaps you can tell us a bit for the start, how is the US looking at Europe? How is the US perceiving the European gas and energy market?
Well, thank you, Heiko, and it is really great to be here this morning. And yeah, indeed, I have literally just got off the plane back from a very short visit to Washington, D.C. We're with a group of companies from the EU, and we met with a lot of companies from the US with a strong interest in LNG. And so to answer your question, I would say this: I think that we also had the chance to meet US administration officials who came and addressed us. They were very happy to see European companies there. And there's a lot of talk about the new strength of relationship, particularly in energy, between Europe and the US. Because the war in Ukraine changed everything, and the US see us as their strong allies. They talk about us being on the front line in this current war, and they want to do as much as they can to help us make sure that we are able to keep the lights on, keep people warm, keep people cooking their food. And in that regard, we talked a lot about how we would, of course, build closer relationships to do more business and to bring more LNG from the US to the EU. You did touch a good point there, Heiko. I mean, there is a certain degree of soreness on the American side about the European response to the IRA, the Investment Reduction Act, because they saw that, at least the administration officials saw that as their attempt to really push forward a green change, a step change in the way the US has been performing on climate. And I think that somehow they thought that we would be very happy to see it, which of course we're not. Well, in Eurogas, we're relatively okay in principle. There are probably certain elements, but I think the automotive industry is pretty upset, and that's a big industry for us. And so, yeah, I think they were a little bit surprised, though. I'm not sure how much of that surprise is real, but that's the impression they were giving. We're doing our best. We're doing this for the climate. We thought you'd like it, Europe.
I think we can perhaps come back, because it's really, I think, an interesting question whether the impact of the IRA, at least from an energy perspective, will be a positive or negative one on the European industry. But perhaps let's focus a bit first on what you mentioned about LNG. What does that mean concrete? As far as I understand, so far there's like really like freedom gas, but it's commercial business for the US, or are there different signals from your meeting now in Washington?
Well, I think that what we can say is that last year we had 52 billion cubic meters of LNG from the US, which of course is a record, and up almost about 80% on the year before. So we are seeing a really big increase in the amount of US LNG that we have. There are issues about how much more could come. And of course, you'll know very well, Heiko, that the Chinese economy has come out of its lockdown. And so there is there's a certain era now, perhaps, of competition again for Europe and China. And as you rightly pointed out, the US LNG industry is commercial. So in essence, they don't have a sort of preferred seller. We don't have a free trade agreement with the US. So they sell it on the market. And the Department of Energy don't really look at, what is the destination of the gas when they sign off export licenses. So that basically means that it is open for whoever can get it. On the other side, they do put a greater premium on the political level, at least, of making sure that there should be enough LNG for the Europeans. And they understand, as we have in Eurogas, as countries in Europe have agreed, that we need to be free of Russian gas by the end of this decade. And that means that we will have to look at new like Qatar will have to come in. But I think much more important is to build that relationship with the US. We are like-minded blocs. We are rule of law, democracy-loving regions. And I think that that's, where it stands us apart from others.
Well, I think currently sometimes some tiny question marks about the democracy-loving in the US, but that should not be the topic for today. I think
I won't answer the questions on that.
There are similar question marks about some countries in Europe too. Therefore, I think we leave it like that. But again, what does that mean? As far as I understand, what we discussed, at least here in Germany, and I think it's a topic for Europe anyway, that in principle, the necessity to have long-term contracts to foster or to underpin new investment in LNG facilities, even in the US, is a bit contradictory to our decarbonization aims here in Europe. Have you discussed ideas how to bridge it, or don't you think it's a big issue?
I think it is an issue. I think that's very clear. We understand that as well. I mean, the legislation that's on the table, the gas directive, which is currently being discussed by the member states and the European Parliament, includes a date of 2049 for the end of long-term contracts in terms of being unabated, which means that after 2049, the emissions have to be abated. Nobody knows what abated means. There is no definition of it, and we've asked the European Commission and have not received a proper response. So you could say that if you want to sign a 20-year contract, you would still be able to run a 20-year contract until 2043. But after that, you would have to worry, so going to 2049, have to prove how to get rid of the emissions. Just before we come back, Heiko, just to answer in full, it's not just about the fact you could have a 20 because legally you can do it. The question is whether or not the demand will be there. That's actually really what I wanted to get to, because in the end, you can say legally we can do any long-term contract, we want even 25 years today. But the fact is, what we aren't clear about in Eurogas, and certainly what the European Commission hasn't been particularly clear about, is what will be the certainty of demand, as we call it, the certainty of demand. How much gas will still be consumed? And if you are on a 20-year contract, what is the implication for your risk profile if there isn't demand for that gas in Europe?
And what is the answer? What is your view on that, and how will companies cope with that difficulty or that hurdle?
Well, I think we have to look at the business models that will work, and at least 15-year contracts. We don't have to go to 20 or 25 years, are probably a starting point. There is the issue of destination clauses. So you can have a contract with an American provider, and you could have an open-ended destination clause. But in the end, it will come down to price, because if you buy gas at a specific price today that is fixed or even indexed over time, and you can't still sell or use that gas in Europe, and you have to sell it somewhere else, well, say you're going to sell it to Pakistan, just for example, are they going to pay as much as you paid for it in your long-term contract? And that's an open question, Heiko. So that's where the risk comes in. And so that's why we can't really say that there is an definitive solution to it, because not even having an open destination clause can guarantee that you will get the return on your investment. So there's definitely risk. There's no escape from that.
How supportive is the EU Commission regarding that point? Well, at the end of last year, the Commission, you're very, very familiar with that, passed 2 direct regulations which are addressing to some extent even the issue of LNG or of the future role of LNG by trying to allow or facilitate procurement joint ventures and a joint procurement platform by trying to establish a new LNG benchmark price. Does that signal at the end of the day that the EU Commission will lend support to make long-term contracts, at least 15 years contracts, happen in the LNG sector?
I think the European Commission are very aware of the fact that they will need to make long-term contracts happen. We've also had conversations with DG Competition, Heiko, because that's important. And DG Competition are very open to the idea of individual companies doing long-term contracts for the time being. When we start talking about joint purchasing, it becomes less clear what DG Competition would stomach. And I think that we could say at this stage, we're looking more at how the demand aggregation platform will work to aggregate demand in relation to storage obligations that have been set down in the regulations you refer to. There is no legal requirement to do joint purchasing, but you could imagine that if demand aggregation takes place on this platform, that a supplier, a European supplier, could offer to fill that demand aggregation, and you could argue then that that's a type of joint purchase. DG Competition would be very interested in what information would be shared between that European buyer on behalf, if you will, and the group of companies it's buying for. So we still have to wait to get to the end of that story to see whether or not that will be possible, Heiko.
But that means to have a kind of intermediate summary that we are not in a very comfortable situation currently regarding future supplies, because the potential need for long-term contracts is not really backed by the sufficient long-term security of demand, and there is, at least for the time being, no clear political support or to bridge these different perspectives.
It's interesting because, I mean, you're right, but also slightly incorrect, because there is political support on both sides of the Atlantic for long-term contracts, because both sides politically know, so both politicians and both policymakers know, you need long-term contracts to make new investments happen in the US. So they kind of know that they have to do it. It's then a question of how that fits with their own rhetoric about decarbonizing the economy by 2050. In the gas industry, we're of course very committed to meeting net zero. We can see the value of continuing contracts. But we are, going back to your earlier question, we are thinking about other things as well. How can those contracts over time be adapted to make sure that CO2 emissions go down, that methane emissions go down? And I think that is really very much part of it. Can you start blending biogas, or as the Americans call it, renewable natural gas, into that shipment? And then the next stage is, of course, hydrogen, and whether or not those contracts could be variable at the end to say whether or not you could replace volumes of LNG with hydrogen. So we're going to have to be creative, but in principle, both sets of policymakers are supportive. As you know, I don't have to tell you actually, Heiko, your government has done this LNG Accelerator Act, which means that you go from zero LNG import capabilities in February 2022 to, by the government's own figures, 44.5 BCM by December this year. So politically, they know that they need LNG, and that's what's driving it.
But you of course, you're well aware that infrastructure does not mean contracts, and you're of course aware that in this German act on speeding up development of LNG terminals, the deadline for the utilization of these terminals for unabated LNG is even tighter than in the EU regulation with 2042. that means there are still open questions. I wonder, you raise a lot of, I think, very important questions. I wonder how much time do we have? How much time has Europe to find answers and come to action?
Well, I think that we know very well that we are facing a very stark energy environment. The war in Ukraine has taught us a very tough lesson. In essence, we have to now make sure that we diversify very strongly and very effectively. This means that we don't want to resource our gas from just one place in the future, and that we will need to work with people like Qatar, but we also don't want to become overly dependent on them. And so I think that the one thing I would say is that, yeah, infrastructure, though, does depend on contracts. And I mean this in the sense that when you have even permitting being given to potential projects in the US, they cannot get the financing from banks unless they can demonstrate that they have a contract in their hand. So what we have to do in Europe is sign up to contracts so that those FIDs, sorry, shouldn't use those acronyms, the final investment decision can be taken to actually deliver on the even on the permitted project. And so, yeah, when you're saying that, yeah, infrastructure doesn't mean contracts, you're right, but contracts can mean infrastructure. And I think that we have to look at it like that. Yeah, 42 is relatively around the corner, but there's still 15-year contracts that we would see would be enough to trigger those investments. And from the US side, they don't feel that they are forever locked in to providing for Europe, but that would be one of their priorities in the short term, particularly as we are, as I said, on that front line in dealing with the war in Ukraine.
Okay, just to again to make a kind of intermediate summary, do you think that means for the crucial for the future development of the natural gas, of the gas market, let's keep it more general, it is crucial that over the next 1 or 2 years European players sign a decent number of LNG long-term contracts together to have a more stabilized market?
We're going to have to, and also. Not just that, that's where the political direction is going. You will remember in March 2022, President Biden and President von der Leyen signed a statement which said there should be 50 billion cubic meters of US LNG coming every year through to 2030. So there is a political premium on delivering that. And I think that's one of the reasons why
you really bet on that political premium? Take into account what you said earlier, that it's a commercial business in the US?
Yeah, but I do believe it's impossible to say how many BCM we will have every year, whether it's 40, 50 or 60, Heiko. I don't think we're going to beat around the bush on that one. But the reality is that we're going to need that LNG. There aren't other suppliers. It's Qatar and it's in the US. They're the two big ones that we have to look at. And they're for the ones that we will be focusing on to make sure that we are able to deliver what is needed. One thing I would say about the crisis is that a lot of people had sort of stopped talking about natural gas and moved on to talk about other things. The war in Ukraine and Russian invasion has really led to a long discussion, I think, appreciation of how important it is to have natural gas as a transition fuel. That was clear last year when you saw the heat wave that struck Europe. Many countries are using natural gas just to keep the lights on.
Yeah, but on the other hand, what might be a conclusion to open the agenda a bit as to get out of natural gas earlier than ever planned. That would be another conclusion to get rid of or phase out natural gas as fast as possible, in particular, for example, in the heating market.
It depends where your gas comes from, and obviously we'd fully support removing the 150 BCM of Russian gas. However, when you look at somewhere like Norway, which is an entirely reliable supplier, has a very strong program for things like carbon capture and storage, also developing offshore wind with a view to create green hydrogen, I think that we surely shouldn't get ahead of ourselves and start talking about the end of gas. I think the reality is that there will still be plenty of gas being used from our reliable, like-minded sources well into the 2030s and 40s. We also have to keep an eye on the fact that you are right. There will be less gas. Eurogas recognizes that. We forecast probably around somewhere between 260 and 290 BCM by 2030, which is a considerable reduction from where we were in 2020. Well, it's about 100 to 150 BCM. Well, we can identify where that's going. But I think that in principle, we aren't saying that it's the end of gas in housing. It's very easy to say, okay, we're just all going to get a heat pump, but that's not necessarily the way that you would also even necessarily reduce the demand for gas. And I just remind you, Heiko, that the Bundesnetzagentur have already said that some parts of Germany will face electricity rationing next year because they can't keep up with the rates of heat pumps and electric vehicles that are going into the grid. And so they'll be burning plenty of natural gas to keep the lights on and keep the heat pumps going. There's some sort of irony in this, I do believe. And I think that if you're going to do lots of heat pumps, you're going to need to also invest a lot in your electricity distribution grids, and that requires copper and other materials from around the world. And so there should be a proper assessment of how much copper will be needed to reinforce the grids. Therefore, I don't think we're seeing the end of heating and gas, because we also have the possibility to bring in biomethane. We also have the possibility to bring in hydrogen. There are different options, and we will need them all.
Yeah, but nevertheless, we started with that with the end, at least for the time being, of Russian gas and the price spikes in last year, and presumably a higher price level for gas over the next years, and the fact that at least natural gas is carbon emitting. There is a kind of changing playing field or a changing perspective for gas or not?
I think that it's much less emitting than other
yeah, but it's nevertheless it's CO2 emitting.
Yeah, indeed. But I think if you look at some of the steps that have been taken in some countries to continue burning coal, Germany no exception, I think that in the end, it's still, that's what I said at the beginning, it's still a very important transition fuel. That's what the policymakers have identified. That's why they're still talking about 15-year long-term contracts, because we're going to need it. Natural gas's role as a transition fuel has not ended by any stretch of the imagination. We've only speeded up the end of Russian gas, not the end of natural gas.
Yeah, but nevertheless, that was, again, was the way we started talking. You talked yourself about the difficulties to come to long-term contracts, because it is not given that you have a stable future for gas, and that makes it kind of a bit of a tricky situation anyway, and that we have to, I don't know, we have to go find a way out of this situation, which is not a real clear path forward for the time being, as far as I understand. But perhaps I
agree with you on that, Heiko. I agree. I'm not going to argue with any of these points. I agree, and it is very difficult.
I think that's a bit, of course, a result of our chat. But perhaps a more general question towards the end: do you think that what we see currently in the gas market of 2023 is already kind of new equilibrium? Or are we still in a more unstable and crisis situation for the time being? Well, prices came down to a level of 50 to 60 euro. Is that the kind of new normal? Long-term prices are even below 40, or are we still in a transition period and have to see until, I don't know, 2024, 2025 before we see a new equilibrium?
I would say that, Heiko, actually. So you've answered your own question, because I think at the moment we're still relatively in a state of flux as we transition from Russian gas to other suppliers. I think for me personally, and it's not Eurogas for you, I imagine it very difficult to imagine we go back to the 20 euros a megawatt hour type of prices. I think that there will be a new normal, but I think it's more likely to be settled in 24, more like 25, 26, to be honest. And we'll have to see how the next couple of years play out in terms of prices. Of course, we want to make sure that we are able to introduce a certain degree of stability. Long-term contracts do that, but you and I have discussed already at length the difficulties around long-term contracts, but that is what would underpin the stability and would also support the market, which we still need. We still need spot purchases, but if you have an underpinned basis of long-term contracts, it could help anchor the price at a more, at a more of a new normal around the prices where we are today, perhaps even a bit lower.
Final word, what do you think is the most important to watch regarding political framework development or market in 2023? What will be most decisive? What is going to happen this year in European regulation, market, or what else to decide about the path for the next years?
Yeah, I think there are a few different issues, and there's the sort of short term. I think we have to look very carefully at the short term as to how will things like this idea of demand aggregation, joint purchasing play out? Equally, will this MCM, the so-called market correction mechanism, will that be triggered? Because these will have very interesting short-term impacts on the gas market. But on the more mid to long term, we are going to see the completion, hopefully, of the gas and hydrogen decarbonization package, which should set forward the direction that the sector will be taking, including things like as the European Parliament's putting forward decarbonisation targets for the gas sector, in line with what you've been asking me about, saying that by 2030 we have to have 20% less GHG emissions compared to 2018. These are ideas that I think we might see very much deliver, therefore, the next generation of gases in a much more concerted fashion, like biomethane, like hydrogen. And so this is worth keeping an eye on, because you have to see what is the framework that's going to be set up for the decarbonisation of the gas sector.
Okay. I think market correction mechanism, 180 euro per megawatt hour would be the triggering level, very likely or not?
Again, very difficult to respond to. One would say that I think when I speak to a lot of the members, a lot of them have already bought, at least for the mid to long term, in terms of the amount of gas that they need. However, there's a lot of short-term unknown demand from industry, which would have to be procured. So whilst you have the storage obligation filling going on, you also have already guaranteed that many companies already bought their next winter's supply for their consumers. The variable will be what the industry demand is. And I think that that's where it becomes very difficult to bet, because it's not impossible you could get a price spike at a specific point. But one would like to think that the market correction mechanism has been built with enough caveats in it for it never to be triggered. So congratulations to the European Commission for that.
Okay, I think that's a very nice ending of our fire chat. Thank you very much again, James, for joining me and for the overview you gave. I think originally I planned to talk more about market correction mechanism and other things, but I think the starting point LNG conference was too good to use it, and I think it was very interesting to see your points on this, and I think it's very important. I think it seems to be very important to see for the next years how Europe will cope with the necessity to organize LNG supplies to find a new market equilibrium. Thank you very, very much, and I hope you can have a bit of sleep now, although you have to continue to work. Okay.
Board meeting tomorrow, so it's no rest of the wicked, Heiko. And vielen Dank für die Einladung. And
thank you very much again for joining.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you so much.
Bye.
And have a good day.
Likewise. Thank you.
Thank you. We will be continuing after just a quick break. We will be adding a few chairs to our virtual panel and changing the original language here back to German. Just after, about 5 minutes, we will be back with the panel discussion that is announced in the agenda. Okay. See you then.
society is demanding change. Change to more competitive, reliable, cleaner energy. To meet this demand, the energy market is transitioning to a lower carbon future. Shell Energy, a trusted global supplier, is here to help customers make the transition, offering better ways to power business today for a cleaner tomorrow.
Einen wunderschönen guten Morgen von meiner Seite aus.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome, everybody on their screens joining us for the panel discussion about the current crisis and what it means for the future of the gas market. I will discuss this with Thomas Gößmann. He is chairman of the executive board for Thyssengas. Egbert Laege, General Manager of Secure Energy for Europe, or SEFE, and Dr. Sopna Sury, she's COO for hydrogen for RWE. So, good morning and welcome, everybody. And we will not do the ladies first order, but rather go from the past towards the future. That means I will start with Egbert Laege. You're originally a trader. You had trading functions for E.ON and then EEX. And for about a year now, you're managing director of a company securing energy for Europe that has now been nationalized, taken over by the government. So that is really quite a history. It was originally Gazprom Germania, and then a disc jockey took over, and now you are subject to the Federal Network Agency. I think since the 20th of December last year, you're officially a state-owned company. So what does this mean? Are you still market-driven? Thank you, Heiko Lohmann, first for inviting me, and second for asking such a precise question right away. But it's really very easy for us. Our strategic aim is securing supply and implementing the green transition. Of course, there is a close cooperation with society and the government, but our day-to-day operations, our mid- and long-term strategies are still market-driven or result-driven. So I'm not really a public servant when it comes to those aspects. Of course, we serve the public, we serve the government. Every public company should serve public and government, but apart from that, it's a regular organization with one shareholder, and we are part of the management. So Robert Habeck will not just call you and say, okay, let's get a 20 years contract for LNG with the United States or with Qatar. I don't care what it costs. I will really pick up the tab. Well, Minister Habeck hasn't told me that so far, has not even hinted at it, but of course there is tough competition and there is a conflict between what is needed at the moment and what we want. We have lost a huge portfolio. We now stand for energy supply and security of supply for Europe, in particular for our clients. In order to be able to provide that security, we need long-term contracts. We need new gas to be imported into Europe, and this takes us to LNG. And of course, we look at the suppliers offering at the moment, and they come from the United States and the Middle East. And so what Minister Habeck wants is probably very close to what we are doing. However, should we incur losses as a corporation, we have to account for that. So public funds will not just make up for our losses. So you only conclude contracts when they are profitable. Now, Mr. Gößmann, you are chairman of the executive board of a network operator, but you are originally a mechanical engineer. You know a lot about plant making and facility planning, and I think you all know each other as well. I think you've worked for several companies that are in this industry in general, but not all of them do still exist. You have then become a member of Thyssengas GmbH, where you are now head and chairman of the management. And the hydrogen infrastructure is a very central point for you this year. So what is supposed to happen? Well, first, good morning, everybody, and thanks for inviting me. Before I answer your question, I would like to really cast a look back. We need a very fast increase in volumes and rollout of new systems. A hydrogen modeling has been provided by the industry. This hydrogen modeling is based on a market survey. We asked all our customers across the country, the Federal Republic, and then we collected data, and based on that, we suggested projects. First, you need, of course, approval for these projects. That's already a lot of effort and industrial logic that has gone into that. Since September, we've been waiting for approvals. So you asked what needs to be done, what's supposed to happen. First, you need approvals and you need funds to be released. Second, as a network operator or grid operators, we have to prove that we are able to implement transmissions and transitions. So we have to be able to converge different networks. This has been proven already. We have shown to be efficient. So in the first half of the current year, we need a reliable foundation. I think we should look less towards Brussels, and Germany should really set the framework conditions itself. We need a network for hydrogen and natural gas because we have a communication between these different lines and systems. Loads and volumes in terms of natural gas have to be integrated with the streams of hydrogen. So that's different from those networks where you have a complete separation between the different energy carriers. And that is the main thing that we have to keep in mind. And then we need the legal responsibility. It has to be made clear and put down in writing for the next years what is the legal framework for the transition in North Rhine-Westphalia. We have an integrated network planning already. This is already taking things further. Minister Neubauer has provided a pilot project here for power, gas, water, district heating. But keep in mind the electrolyzers need to be connected with the electricity grid and the hydrogen network. So we have to take all this further. One thing that is really a big hindrance is the issue of cartel law. Hydrogen networks are so far not subject to antitrust legislation. You have certain procedures that you can use in order to get regulated. But so far, we don't have a situation where we can make a heavyweight entrepreneurial decision. What we can do with natural gas, dimensioning of lines, connection points, entry points, cost estimates, this is not allowed for hydrogen so far. We are in touch with the antitrust agency, and of course nobody wants to cross the red lines, so that's a big issue, and such hindrances have to be dealt with. It's similar to the current situation in terms of cooperation. We are all supposed and obliged to cooperate. So we need, of course, the transmission and distribution network operators. And Mr. Lohmann, you know, of course, some of the players in the field, as far as I hear from Brussels. Other countries have already come further than we have in Germany. So security of supply and green transition, if combined, is it all shifted around because of the war on Ukraine? Do the streams move around from east to west, west to east? Do you see a shifting of priorities? Grid planning, network planning, security of supply, green transformation. What's happening at the moment? Well, of course, we see a lot of transport from the west to the east. You can feel that in the east of Germany, from Belgium and the Netherlands. We have high volumes of LNG that we and our colleagues transport through lines that were originally intended to be used for hydrogen. And that means that the LNG logic shifts the system that was intended to be used for hydrogen. But of course, we have to follow the instructions of the Federal Network Agency, and you have a different flow of loads when you compare hydrogen with natural gas. So you have to keep the differences in mind, but we are not allowed to talk together when it comes to the networks because of the antitrust problems. Well, that seems to be quite an interesting issue. Let's maybe get back to that later. Now, Dr. Sury, you are one of the many managers that McKinsey has really gifted us with. You have for a long time been looking into renewable energies. You've been with RWE for some time, and now you are COO for the hydrogen division. You are not an engineer, and I think you have a PhD in international management, but that's, of course, a different topic altogether. Last year, when you look back on the year 2022, what about hydrogen? Was it a lost year in terms of hydrogen, in terms of approvals for projects that you maybe are still waiting for? Was it even a step back in terms of the transformation? Well, I think we are quite on track in terms of the transformation. Mr. Laege, Mr. Gößmann said it before. Last year was a year that focused very much on the security of supply. And this was, of course, monitored to that effect by the federal government. But I think we should emphasize that with an eye to potential customers and buyers, the transformation towards green hydrogen is very important, and the awareness of this significance has increased. And of course, that means we have a need for portfolios to be diversified further. And here we have seen quite some progress in the last year. And I would also like to cast a look back in time, because the coalition government has already taken several steps For instance, you need to show certificates of origin for gas in a way that was not given before, not required before. But what else would you require, or what would you suggest for hydrogen? Well, there should be a national hydrogen strategy that is realistic enough to give an estimate of the demand. 10 gigawatts till 2030. Well, that's a beginning, but it's far away from what the industry is actually going to need. And when you look at the electrolyzers projects, you see that we have maybe 5 or 6 gigawatts of projects which are already known of. So we have this big gap. So a clear target, but also clear incentives in terms of the demand and estimating and assessing the demand for hydrogen. How can a government support such a new industry and new projects? There's a lot of uncertainty at the moment. We do have H2 Global, but still the overall budget and the available volumes show that this is really a drop in the ocean. And I would like to add what Mr. Gößmann mentioned. What does this mean for the infrastructure? It's really given me concerns, reasons for concern, that we don't know exactly which infrastructure to use for hydrogen projects. How can we transport the molecules to the location where they are used? And hydrogen really lives of rollout for renewable energies. So we need a clear allocation of projects and resources. When it comes to renewable energies, we have several programs and projects, but it's really more of a patchwork situation. And when we look to the Netherlands, we can see what else could be done. And if I think in a long-term mindset, we all want to be climate neutral. We want renewable energies, we want hydrogen, but that means we need a clear commitment to hydrogen-compatible gas-fired power plants. And it's difficult to make any plans as long as you don't know what the market design looks like. And that's a big problem, in particular with an eye to 2030.
Did you have a glass of champagne yesterday, or was it just tap water after seeing the delegated act, which is a part of the jigsaw of what you're trying to build up after that was published with about a year's delay? Well, I was actually very happy that after my patients had been tried for a long time, the delegated act was finally published. So we've now got a legal framework, and that's a great help. You have to see that if the rules of the game aren't clear for green power, the production costs and their calculation for hydrogen are very difficult. So I'm euphoric, and it doesn't matter what drink I took. I did not have a glass of champagne, and yes, it is a compromise. The delegated act is far from perfect. It does help in the initial years by using existing renewable assets for green power. But as of 2028, we will have a problem also in Germany if we do not accelerate access to renewables and then cannot rely on existing wind or onshore plants. So the transition periods will expire indeed. And there is also a correlation that's important here with the transition periods. We will, starting in 2029, 2030, we'll have to go back to certain correlations. And the only thing this does is drive up production costs. And this also means that the cost base for customers will increase, and that's certainly not positive. So the gas market post-crisis is a topic we're looking at, and I, as the host of this session, focused on hydrogen and the question of whether hydrogen is the natural successor to gas. So when we look at the status quo, Mr. Laege, Do you think we're still operating in a crisis mode at the moment, or have we already embarked on the path where we can combine security of supply and green power in future? Well, I think when we look at the various dimensions, we have to see that geopolitically, globally, we are certainly in a mode of crisis and still engaged in a crisis. When we look at the German and European energy landscape and supply landscape, we can certainly also say that we are maybe not quite in the crisis mode anymore, in the sense that when I come to my office in the morning, I will find a situation that is drastically different from what I left last night. But we still have the essential root causes for the crisis that are in place, an imbalance of supply and demand on the gas side, and these geopolitical tensions. So at this time, at the moment, and prices show this, we have a somewhat balanced situation, but we do have to expect that this will culminate in an imbalance in the next few months. So I think we need to pay great attention, and that's necessary for us to do. I think this crisis mode certainly has meant that with respect to hydrogen, we've maybe not seen the progress in the last few months we had been hoping for, simply because the ministries were focusing their force and their attention on getting us through this summer, through this winter. I mean, who would have thought that we would see this price level in January and that we would have such an easy filling level with respect to storage, if I can put it that way. But the important thing for us is to pick things up again, refocus, start working on creating the framework conditions that Ms. Sury has mentioned. That really is urgently needed, especially when it comes to the grid issue. It is a core element of security that we need to have in place in order to be able to take the measures we need on the supply as well as demand side for hydrogen to have a chance in the next 2 or 3 years to be a first component and contribution for energy supply in Europe. Certainly, it's good to have ambitious goals, but at some point, we also need to be in a position to actually start working. And for that, we need to have the right framework conditions. And I think really everyone has understood this by now, and everyone is working on this very hard. And that is necessary. And that is also something that is really of a high degree of interest to us as companies. So where can we become involved? How can we contribute to the ramp up of hydrogen? And where we can, we will do so. And on the customer side, on the infrastructure side, on the storage and commercial side, we are involved. And I think that allows us to bridge a gap, or this gap, more quickly, because we have a better assessment of the potential solutions, and we also have the ability of managing them a little bit better. So that's why this is one of our goals. Now, Ms. Sury, you here have a potential cooperation partner in the field of hydrogen by the look of it. Do you agree with Mr. Laege that, yes, we are still in a situation of crisis, and secondly, that this may be one of the reasons as to why we are progressing slowly with respect to hydrogen, or do you think this could actually be helpful in the end? I would say both are true. So the center of attention of the political players, as we've heard, was very much focused on the crisis, and at the same time, it sharpened our awareness for the need to promote climate protection, and hydrogen plays a crucial role here. I also saw that, especially through the US Inflation Reduction Act, not only Brussels, but also Berlin have indeed understood that there is a different way. So it's the awareness of it not just being about Germany. We are in an international competition, and that means that long-term measures must be launched now. So the fact that security of supply is a topic that is not short-term in nature, as well as LNG, and that is why we need long-term partnership. Hydrogen imports, other imports, that's one thing, but of course also security of supply on the green side in the sense of gas power plants, which we need to facilitate. What's very interesting, and what I think we're sometimes missing a little bit in this discussion, is that we all strive for climate neutrality, but this also allows us to make things affordable. And that is something that allows us to take a positive impact, and that's something we often miss. So when we move ahead promoting hydrogen so we can reach a competitive level based on green energies, that's certainly also something that politics is increasingly focusing on. So I think now we need concrete measures and packages to be passed, and we don't need to discuss this endlessly. Well, it's interesting that you think this will allow us to reach a more affordable level, because I think it could be that hydrogen may simply be too expensive. So this might lead to additional problems with respect to affordability. Now with the gas price of 50 euros, do you think it's going to be more expensive? Well, we always have to understand the context in which hydrogen is developing. As of today, we have an energy system where we are lagging behind with respect to the renewables goals. So power generation at zero cost, we've not exploited this by far. So hopefully by 2030, 2040, we will have progressed where power generation costs of renewables will be driving down the general electricity price. And this electricity price amounts to 70 to 80% of the cost of hydrogen production. Of course, currently, green hydrogen is relatively expensive, but it's not the question of looking at things and remaining inactive, but it is really asking ourselves, what can we do now in order to reduce these production costs in the long run? Not doing anything is always the worst choice. If I may briefly come in here, well, please go ahead. I can certainly only endorse what you have said. I started my studies in energy engineering, and back then people said, forget about photovoltaics, maybe that will suffice to light up a bus stop, but you will never manage with the costs to use this as a contribution to security of supply in any shape or form. And I think it's important to focus on the costs of technologies now, but we must not underestimate the learning curve that can result. But we can only activate this learning curve if we start at some point. And then we can't always look at long-term studies only. I think that's what we need to do. And if I may briefly refer to our project here, where in the Gen2 Energy, we procure hydrogen in containers. We know this is not the solution of the future. We are aware of that, but it is one way of at least introducing hydrogen into our system to give customers the opportunity to adjust and to convert processes so we can start learning and just get things started in some way. And I think that's what we need. Yes, such projects involve risk. We will not get rich doing this, but in the long term, we will learn a lot. Also, as a company, we will learn a lot that we will need in order to be able to give hydrogen an economic prowess in the year 2030 and after. And so I think, yes, we need to start. Yes, we need to talk, we need to plan, but we also need to take action. And I think that's exactly where we also need political support to do that. And I think in my own conversations with the ministries, I think I can say people have understood this, and the crisis required all our attention. It was not just about the energy crisis, it was a true global crisis. But I think now we have more time at our disposal again, and I do think that people are working hard on these topics. Mr. Gößmann, does it make you nervous when Mr. Laege talks about transporting hydrogen in containers and trailers? Do you think this could be an alternative to pipeline transportation? Well, to be quite honest, it does not make me nervous, because we can quickly do our calculations based on this curve. As you said, I studied mechanical engineering, but we have to start somewhere. One thing that I feel very positive about is that Mr. Harbeck is returning from Norway and feels that blue hydrogen could indeed be an alternative for the interim period. And I think that's something we can talk about. Blue hydrogen is presumably comparably quickly available in similar volumes. So for the CO2 levy, we can discuss that later, but it would mean that suddenly we have reliable volumes that we can pass on. And I think that will put pressure, mighty pressure, on the grid expansion. So if we have a slow ramp up via renewables or whatever, we can adjust in the medium term, but especially blue hydrogen is available very quickly in large volumes. And that's where maybe we can also ask a question with our local customers. We are discussing things and they ask us, what can you provide? What does it cost? We cannot answer those questions yet. And that is one of the things we need to resolve as soon as possible. Well, what does it cost? As Sury said, in the long run, it won't be more expensive, or at least that's how I am interpreting her words at this point. So these are indeed interesting questions in this transformation. How is the natural gas market developing? We'll have to take a look at that. And I think, Mr. Gößmann, you said that this is like communicating tubes. And there is a relationship between the market development, the hydrogen market, and natural gas market. And from what I understood on the production side, too, there's a lot happening. Also on the customer side. Unfortunately, the issue of transportation remains the crucial missing link where we need to take action. So what's your assessment? Why is it so very difficult for things to move forward here? Did you, as TSOs, make mistakes here? Were you too much focused on thinking along the same lines, or abiding by political requirements? Would we need to separate more? Well, I don't really see there is a lot of added value there, because we have about 60 to 70% of our natural gas lines that could be used for hydrogen. So we need to think holistically here in some way. Did we make mistakes? Well, we started out 3 years ago with a visionary hydrogen grid, and euphoria in Berlin was very limited, if I can put it that way. People said, oh, wow, well done, but the next few steps were not taken. One thing we are still waiting for today is for people to say, let's move this ahead in Germany. We're waiting for the political players to say, okay, how can we start this efficiently? And when you say government influence, well, yes, the government has an influence through approvals by the Federal Network Agency, pipelines, approvals of individual projects, which of course need to be approved. So yes, the government already has a means of influencing the grid expansion. So we are at the ready. We stand at the ready, and I think we have proved this sufficiently. And I'm looking for the right adjective here. So it's making me slightly sad as an engineer who wishes to promote things, to move things forward. Christmas, December 2022, here there was a demand for a report on hydrogen directives, and this was delayed by 12 months. So that's not the speed we want to see in Germany. In 12 months, we we're able to make significantly more technical progress in Wilhelmshaven. So we need to look at the technical dimensions. So the association is ready to have this discussion with the political sphere. How are we going to organize this?
Sie haben das ja vorhin gesagt, es ist ein zentrales Thema.
Dr. Sury, you said earlier it's a central issue and we're not really making progress when it comes to the network. I think you're sitting on the fence, RWE. When it comes to gas networks, you are not really involved. You pass this on. So do you make suggestions to the political level, or is it enough for you to develop individual lines for projects? Well, projects are just a beginning. RWE is not a network operator. We don't want to get into that business, but our intention is very clearly to work at the production side, and the molecules that we produce should get an opportunity to somehow reach the industrial users. And here we do this together, of course, with the respective authorities. But this model of the nuclear infrastructure or core infrastructure must not be hindered by interventions from the government. And of course, if we take responsibilities and possibilities away from the transition network or transmission systems operators, that would be a step backwards. Look towards our neighbors, the Netherlands. There, the government understood rather clearly that infrastructure needs to be supported and subsidized. We have a great system in Germany and it is working, but the TSO need to know that there is a perspective for natural gas networks to be converted to hydrogen networks. And this has to be happening with reasonable criteria in place, so that hydrogen can be fed in and be transported to where it is needed. I think here the private industries can give a very good answer. Every current owner of a pipeline where natural gas is running through will have an interest in this business model remaining profitable for the next 10 to 15 years. You named the Dutch example, and there is also a TSO they have. So maybe this could be the core project that you can suggest to the Minister for the Economy for a state-controlled hydrogen project. That's beyond unbundling, though. When you look at this from an economist perspective, I completely agree with Dr. Sury. We've made the investments. As an economy, many economically organized corporations have made the investments. Now we do have an infrastructure that's already been invested in, and now it's about using that infrastructure and rededicating it to a new framework that also allows for the transport of hydrogen. If we talk of a national hydrogen company owned by the state, that's really black and white. But we shouldn't paint everything black and white, and I don't think that the government will now purchase infrastructure from TSOs without having the expertise and using taxpayers' money. I don't think that's going to happen. And I don't think it is a part of the ideas running through the heads of people working in the ministries. I think it is all a question of market economics. And of course, it's a question of how to achieve progress. How can we move forward? And this makes it necessary that the government and public authorities assume leading roles, for instance, by providing the right organizational framework and possibly also providing some additional momentum. I think that's the debate that is being had at the moment. And this is about concepts, so that's content-wise. discussion, and I get the impression from my colleagues from the TSOs that we all want the same thing. We finally, we finally need to speed things up. We have to make progress. And I think that's where we are at the moment. But on the other hand, we learned last year, this is very much true for the gas markets, but also for the electricity markets in a way. In a situation of crisis, the state really intervened. And Minister Habeck is really proud of having stabilized markets with state intervention. But when you look at the further evolution of this transition, will the state intervention not remain at this rather high level? Because it's one of the lessons that politicians have learned from the crisis. So there is more belief in the state now when it comes to the energy industry. Well, I think we are at a kind of tipping point, at a crossroads. But if a corporation now says, oh, this is dangerous, let's wait for what they decide in Brussels or in Berlin, then, of course, we reached a point where political authorities, public authorities will decide to take things into their own hand. And so we should, before that happens, show that the principles of the market economy can work, and we can provide a market-compatible framework with plannability, accessibility, and the changes that will be needed should be viable. But if you readjust this framework time and again, you won't get the investments you need. And then the public money has to be used again, which the government doesn't really want, because they want the market economics to be at play here. So we should get together again to discuss and determine the framework conditions. And then we can say, okay, this is how it is. We are in a position to make an investment. We are in a position to trigger a network and transmission line project that can be first used for LNG and then later used for hydrogen. But we're not really getting ahead, are we? You said it yourself, Mr. Gößmann. Do you think we need more, or will we have more intervention from the state? Well, we shouldn't confuse symptoms and causes. I think the state intervention last year was the right thing to do because we were in an extreme situation. And this has to be a sovereign decision, and you have to protect the consumers. Gas prices were skyrocketing. And of course, it's the right thing to do for the state, for the government to assume an active role. Playing an active role, in my eyes, also includes bringing incentives into play. And of course, we need the market economic framework. And for the hydrogen industry, you will need higher investments for getting things off the ground. But the government is not necessarily the better manager, because I think there is more expertise elsewhere. Take the infrastructure as an example. We do have TSOs. They have the staff, they have the experts, they have the knowledge, in spite of the lack of skilled labor at the moment. How should a state-owned agency be able to get all that expertise and skills together overnight? So I don't think we are in an acute crisis any longer. So we should really let the market economics make their own way. And of course, the state can provide incentives and support, but it shouldn't be an active player in the field anymore. I have the feeling we've been going around in circles for years, but Mr. Gößmann, here's a question for you from our chat. You can answer this first or later. How extensive will the gas network be in the year 2050? How much of the existing network will remain after the transformation? That's one of the initial questions I asked myself. Is hydrogen the result of the gas industry transforming? Or will hydrogen be the end of the gas industry? Thanks for this question. I will try to give a sufficient answer, but I would also like to tie on to what Dr. Sury said about causes and symptoms or causes and effects. This is not about shifting the blame around, but since the Dutch started to reduce their gas exports and then they announced to end them completely in 2028, we had a shifting of the volumes coming from Russia, 55% of supplies. And our government was simply leaning back and watching things unfold. So they created this situation, which they now had to solve during the crisis with state intervention. This one-sided dependency was wrong to begin with. No company, we talked about the security of supply, no company is ready to be dependent upon just one supplier so extremely. So this was too big a risk, and they didn't pay close enough attention. Now, the second question is future of hydrogen. We have 40,000 kilometers of transmission lines at the moment. There are some distribution networks, part of that. So the question is, how much hydrogen will we need? There is this magic figure of 500,000 terawatt hours and 250,000 terawatt hours in terms of biogas. So out of today's volume in terms of molecules, there will be maybe 500 coming from hydrogen. If it's 150, 250, it will be methane. So 75%. I think this is a rather conservative assessment. That's our assessment. Fraunhofer has published a survey in the Handelsblatt. They are talking approximately 10,000 kilometers of lines for the actual transportation. That's their forecast based on what we know today. Now, if we say hydrogen will be relevant to a higher volume than we are assuming, then of course we need less lines. So our suggestion is to kick this off with an initial amount of lines and networks, and we should be able to translate this into practice till the year 2030. Of course, this entails a certain risk, but then we will be able to see how the market evolves. Similar to what happened in the 70s. We can see what happens, and then it will evolve according to what happens at the market. We will not operate such networks which will not go from entry to exit point. So you're saying the government was in charge, or rather responsible, for the fact that we became so dependent upon Russian gas, and well, the necessity to salvage Uniper, who are not represented here today, was really down to bad government. Well, that's an anti-thesis. But I'm really grateful that you said it and that you mentioned gas once more again, or put gas onto the agenda once more. Last year, that was an extreme crisis. 2021, 22, the gas market really went out of control. Now we see some consolidation. You represent a state-owned company. Your big competitor, Uniper, is also state-owned. So we see a kind of nationalization of the gas procurement. The price level is at 50-60 euros at the moment, clearly high above the original level. You mentioned all the social problems and the way we're dealing with problems of society. Of course, we came very quickly to the questions of transformation, but I would like to go back to your ideas regarding the future evolution of the gas market. We went to the topic of hydrogen very quickly, but will the gas market consolidate? Does it have a solid foundation for consolidating itself, or will the gas market necessarily remain unstable? In particular, when you look at heating, will the need for stability increase? What is your take on this? Do you think, also from the viewpoint of a TSO, that there is a consolidation at the gas market, and will this be a good foundation for an orderly transformation, or is it rather a confused situation at the moment? Mr. Gößmann. In terms of gas volumes, I would like to refer you to the traders, but you do the infrastructural planning. Let's do this in concrete terms. You have LNG infrastructure, a lot of additional infrastructure. You do the network planning. You say it's too much that they are planning at the moment. We need to do this at a lower level according to demand. And that is the foundation for network planning. So yes, that's right. That's what we've started doing. We said it doesn't really make sense to continue our old rollout schedule, and we are reducing the network plans, also in dependency on the plan of the Federal Network Agency and the load schemes. And of course, this will be less than we originally thought.
But this does mean that the outcome of the crisis is a decline in gas demand compared to pre-crisis, right? Well, first of all, there has been a change to the load flow that we're seeing. And the second question we need to investigate is that it's not a question of volume, as you well know. It is a question of capacity. Excuse me? There are decreases there too. We have to look closely where they are, how are they linked to storage, so we can fill storage and we avoid local bottlenecks. So it's not quite so trivial to answer this. But the global response to your question is, yes, we are aware, and we are adapting the framework of scenarios we're discussing with the Federal Network Agency. Mr. Laege said that we are building up infrastructure, also new LNG infrastructure, which we might now use for LNG, but in future may use for green molecules. With your network planning, is this a scenario you are taking into account as a base case, or would you say, Mr. Laege, you're too optimistic here? We don't expect that this will play a role to this extent. Well, the pipes that are now being built, of course, are all H2 ready, potentially, and are also envisioned for hydrogen transportation. So I can only return this, Mr. Laege, if we are going to receive hydrogen in Wilhelmshaven, we're going to be able to pass it on. So you're not sure whether Mr. Laege is right that what we have now may be used for hydrogen in future, or ammonia, or whatever we may convert into hydrogen later on. Well, what we hear from our customers, of course, is that there is a lot of activity with respect to ammonia underway, and I think we need to give these projects a little bit of time to become more concrete. If I may briefly come in on this, I actually think when it comes to your questions on gas, it's really about starting somewhere and then at some point withdrawing. So it's not about taking a top-down decision for natural gas for all eternity. I think we can all agree that it is now a necessary molecule, but also a temporary one. But whether this transition period will last 10 or 15 years will also be crucially determined by how quickly we can start in other fields. And the average price level has also increased as a consequence of the development. So when we believe in the market, we will also see an increasing number of consumers who will no longer rely on natural gas for economic reasons alone. And automatically, this will lead to a shift towards green molecules. I think this is a very important aspect, and infrastructure investments, yes, are absolutely necessary, but they have to be viable in the long term. And I personally do not know of a single project which isn't already considering potential ammonia imports. So this is something that could be built on in future. I think that's a very important point. And that's exactly the idea behind my question at the end of the day. The question is, to what extent do we have a market situation with respect to natural gas that can lead to a transformation with respect to green molecules, or is the situation that we have incentives for a transformation towards direct electrons? If I discuss this topic with industrial consumers, they say, I now need a transformation to other energy systems. I need it now. I need it fast. I now have this high price level that pushes me to go out there, but hydrogen currently isn't available. And then this may create incentives via high temperature solutions rather than hydrogen-based solutions. So that's really the idea behind my question. It's not so much about the consolidation alone. Is it positive or negative for a potential transformation towards hydrogen? Well, we all want to come in on that, but that's great. So I think Mr. Laege was a little bit faster than Mr. Gößmann. So yeah, you were the first to push the button. Well, I think we live in a world where we are seeing a very fast technological development. And what we see today may not be the reality 10 years down the track. It may not be the crucial technology that we are going to see then. From the perspective of natural gas, that was your question we speak about tomorrow, but for the time being, let's speak about the here and now. Let's speak about today. Here, my assessment would be as follows. We see a decrease of demand for natural gas that we have to adjust to. This is due to higher prices, more efficiency measures, taking an impact economically, hydrogen, other green gases taking away market shares, and the electrification of many, when it comes to heating, there will be demand lost there. Is this something that is going to be absolutely dramatic? I think no, because we are also seeing an imbalance of supply and demand at the moment. And also, we have the long-term goal of decarbonizing our energy economy. So partly this does go hand in hand. And I think, and here I'm speaking as an importer, the responsibility of importers is not to say, oh, well, maybe in 10 to 15 years, it'll only be half that, so I'm not going to even import now. But in long-term import contracts, we need to also negotiate a flexibility that will allow to respond quickly and flexibly to changes in the energy economy here in Germany and Europe. So we now need the security of long-term contracts, yes, but they must be flexible enough to be reduced gradually when other energy sources and carriers become available in Europe or there's a change in demand. So we will need to do both. We need to maintain an infrastructure. We need to organize contracts to correspond to the past consumption level, but we also have to be prepared for the fact or the potential that LNG will decrease in the short or medium term, ideally by 2040 being reduced to zero. And as Mr. Gößmann said, for infrastructure, that other gases may be piped through this infrastructure, but possibly no longer at a level of 1,000 terawatt hours, but at a lower level than that. And what technologies will really be the crucial ones at what point in time, I think, is something where we really will have to pay close attention rather than saying, okay, I'm going to take a look now, and then that will hold true for the next 10 years. Okay, Mr. Gößmann, Ms. Sury, you are welcome to come in with your comments. Well, you said, what does the small or medium-sized company do if hydrogen is unavailable? It will turn to electricity. That's the alternative. I don't think that alternative really exists, because ask the TSOs, how long does it take them to expand their transmission network? So there is a choice between either getting no electricity or getting no hydrogen. So what will the SME do? They will turn elsewhere where they can get what they need. And I think that's also the big risk of our current situation. We are really moving towards a deindustrialization. We need quick decisions now on infrastructures. And this is indeed something that I'm very, very concerned about. And I believe it is something we should discuss more. Ms. Sury, I can only endorse what Mr. Gößmann said. It's not an either-or decision, and it's not that power could substitute all other means. Electrification has its limitations in many applications. Of course, we should use electricity as far as available, also with green availability, potentially, that's clear. But in many material applications, we will not be able to do without molecules. So that is something that is very important to me. And when it comes to hydrogen, I'm not quite sure whether this is always clear to everyone. Hydrogen is different from natural gas. It's not a new energy source. Hydrogen is a means of storage for green, renewable energies. So electricity will have to be produced before that anyway. And then we have to think of, where does this power come from? How can it be provided, converted, transported via infrastructures? Sometimes infrastructures cannot be built up that quickly on the electricity side. But again, to me, that's not an either or. We need it on both sides, both on the gas transportation side as on the electricity transportation side. Only then can it work. Okay, Ms. Sury, Mr. Gößmann, Mr. Laege, thank you very much for this very lively discussion. All of our viewers, I thank you very much for your attention. I hope you enjoyed this panel discussion. One thing I can certainly take away is that the gas market is consolidating at the moment. How it will turn out, we shall see. The transformation process towards hydrogen or derivatives is something that all market participants are keeping a close eye on. At the moment, it really appears that infrastructure is the crucial point for further advancement, and then the further development of the overall framework to allow for a ramp up. Everyone is really at the ready or has already taken the first step, and how it will play out exactly. Unfortunately, we still seem to be turning around in circles a little bit in Germany, and we hope that in the course of 2023, we are going to be able to advance, so we don't see the scenario mentioned by Mr. Laege, that this situation of crisis, which is still prevailing but has abated somewhat, will see a resurgence. So thank you all very much for your contributions, and I think I will hand back to Anna at this point. Goodbye. Thank you. Yes, exactly. Thank you very much, Heiko, for this very lively role of a host that you assumed in this panel discussion. I really enjoyed watching it, and I would also like to thank our three panelists for their participation, who showed great flexibility and lively participation in the course of the discussion, and we're really happy to engage. Thank you, Heiko, for this great summary.